your revelations this morning are now breaking the internet, and I just want to tee you up here. You say that some of the unredacted names are women, and that there is now a op to cover the crimes by claiming that you yourself were a victim, even though you were assisting in human trafficking with Jeffrey Epstein. We're going to put your tweets up on the screen, and please, the floor is yours. What have you uncovered here?
Yeah, so I actually went in with a number of members of Congress. I'm actually going to be heading back today. I went in yesterday, and I spent some time looking at some of the most widely circulated emails. As you know, some of these emails, and I have my notes actually right here, had included, ages 10 and 11.
Yeah.
There was that famous redacted email referencing Snow White, the little girl is naughty, all of these things. So I actually went through. And what I found, to my surprise, as well as other members of Congress, to include Democrats, saw some of these were coming from women. Now, the reason for the redactions that we're being told is that these are alleged victims, and then also even some of those beef jerky emails that are also very weird, also coming from women as well. Now, what Jeffrey Epstein and what has become apparent is that he was using his victims, ultimately grooming them to become traffickers. But at a certain point, I think it begs the question, if you are knowingly, as an adult, engaging in potentially the trafficking, maybe even more nefarious acts with children, potentially resulting in bodily harm, etc., at what point do you no longer become a victim and are now a co-conspirator? What's been interesting, though, is that I think that the statute of limitations, remember, the Jeffrey Epstein saga specifically is decades of information that's been compiled. And so there is certain statutes of limitations of which the DOJ might not be able to prosecute. However, if they use a civil rights statute, they can, to my knowledge, bring forward prosecutions. And it has been interesting because some people are saying, well, in order to get other names, remember, there's millions upon millions of files, but in order to name names, is it possible to potentially give immunity to some of these victims, not Ghislaine, but some of the victims, in exchange for testimony and naming names? Remember, we still have not received names from those victims directly. We were promised them. I also understand, though, that there is an active lawsuit with Deutsche Bank. But clearly, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Clearly, there's some very disturbing information. But what's been so horrifying to observe in all of this, Benny, is that you have victims that were then turned to traffickers. You clearly have instances where children were being discussed, and very disturbing emails, as everyone is publicly going into and diving into right now. But also, too, there's this aspect of this that has become political. And so if you're looking to truly receive justice for everyone involved, and then you see that people are taking certain things, knowing that we can see redacted information and then coming out and trying to implicate the president of the United States, obviously that's disturbing. But when you have ABC and multiple outlets, to include Forbes, being forced to report that the president essentially was largely responsible for Epstein's takedown, I think that pretty much says everything that needs to be said pertaining to the president's involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. And so we know that he really helped lead the charge. I just hope that people can stay focused on the issues at hand here. And I really am going to encourage the Department of Justice to consider using the civil rights statute to bring forward prosecutions, and hopefully get justice for these victims.
Yeah, okay, so talk me through that. How would a prosecution work here? Because that is what everybody is asking for. Can we get a single person to suffer a single consequence?
Well, look, right now, again, we have not received names from the DOJ. Granted, we can go in and look at some of the files, but ultimately this entire prosecution would have to come out of what I would say is the Department of Justice. Now, again, there's a statute of limitations for which crimes can be prosecuted, but if they consider using the civil rights statute, and granted, I'm not an attorney, but just based on some of my research, if they consider using that, and they work with some of the victims potentially in immunity, they may be able to bring it forward. But even looking through the numbers of files, I mean, there is this gray area of, okay, well, who exactly knew what? And so if the victims can come forward and provide direct testimony, I haven't had nearly enough time to go through 3 million plus files, but even in just some of the stuff that I have seen, I do think that there is enough information to potentially open up investigations, at least hearing what the victims have to say and see if they can bring forward criminal prosecution using the civil rights statute to do that, as trafficking is covered by that.
So you've uncovered crimes here that you could charge third parties with.
Well, I haven't uncovered crimes. I'm simply going over the information that a lot of other people have been given access to, and I've been able to see names as well as other members of Congress. But remember, some of the names that we're seeing, some of the more egregious emails are coming from women, and those women are claiming to be victims. To be clear, not all of the victims engaged in this type of behavior, right? There is legitimately disturbing stuff where we know for a fact that, Jeffrey was engaged in pedophilia. That's a fact, even same with Ghislaine. So this idea that Ghislaine's attorney would be asking for a pardon is crazy to me, in exchange for testimony, because she was the worst of the worst. If you read some of even the grand jury, which some of these redactions, the large pages are actually grand jury testimony, because it involves private information regarding victims, etc. But the point is that, this is a lot bigger than I think a lot of people anticipated. And so this is clearly going to require not just, a member of Congress per se. I think it needs like a task force out of the Department of Justice solely, focused on civil rights statute violations, interviewing victims, seeing which victims can come forward. But again, a lot of those really egregious emails, the ones that I needed, that I had stated, those were allegedly coming from victims.
Okay, so what about Les Wexner? Now, Les Wexner was listed as a co-conspirator here. He's the billionaire who gave Jeffrey Epstein kind of the fuel in order to internationalize his trafficking operation. He was in charge of L Brands. This is a brand, obviously, that has a background with abuse. What about that? What about Les Wexner? Should he be charged?
So there's been a subpoena that has been sent to come testify to Congress out of oversight that was passed unanimously, I believe, about a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. And so, it appears that he'll be coming in. But again, Congress, and this is kind of where the division of powers come, right? We're not a punitive action arm. So there's only a certain amount of power that we have to be able to essentially enforce justice.
Sure.
Now, that's why I'm recommending that the DOJ consider opening up and basically assigning a task force that can maybe go at this from the civil rights statute perspective and see if there can be something done there. But as you're seeing, Jeffrey Epstein was very well connected. A lot of people, some of the most influential people in the world, whether or not they knew about what he was up to, were connected. And then some that didn't very much so knew what he was up to. And you can see that in some of the emails and correspondence. But ultimately, I think what's going to happen is, you're going to see this being used. You're going to see people that want the truth, that want justice. And then you're going to be seeing people that are trying to use this as a means of smearing the administration or smearing the president. But remember, it was both Democrat and Republican administrations previous to President Trump that had the files and did nothing with this. Multiple attorney generals had the files and did nothing with this. Multiple people had the files within the statute of limitation to include why the heck did the state of Florida not aggressively pursue this? Correct. I have questions. You're right. Like, I'm a Florida rep, but again, you can only do what is right and start from what you've been given. And I think that this is way bigger than just any one person. This is going to take a select team to go forward and really, I think, bring justice for everyone involved.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the emails, 10 years old, 11 years old, starting to creep people out a lot. The jerky emails, the obsession with the jerky. What was that exactly? You've seen the files. What was that?
I have seen some of them. I was able to look at so the way that it goes in, when you go in, you're basically at a terminal and you can research that. You can actually code in the EFTA numbers, right? So you get the numbers. And so we're having to manually write it down. And then you can't take your notes out with you. They give us a pad of paper. So the notes that you go in with, you can't take out with you, but you can write down certain things on a piece of paper, take that out with you. But specifically for that, I was simply looking to see who the actual heck sent these files, because they are disturbing. And these are the ones that are widely being circulated. And those are, for the most part, coming from women. And so those women being redacted are alleged victims. Granted, we don't have a list of names at the DOJ that who's who, but it was known, and I've talked to some of the victims, not the ones in those emails clearly, but the victims will tell you themselves, and everyone knows this, that Jeffrey Epstein was coercing young girls. He would then have them go recruit. But I also too remember, I think that there's a certain point when you could have a terrible thing happen to you, but then to go a step further, there's some really dark stuff in those emails. And, even going as far as, mocking Jesus. I mean, there's a certain level of humanity. And if you don't believe in good and evil and God and the devil, I think by the time you're done going through these files, you will.
Yeah, it's like purely demonic. They're mocking a little girl praying to Jesus to save her.
Yeah.
And of course, also, if you view people as not creations of God, but as things to be tortured or abused, then you clearly have no light in your soul at all.
No, and
You're clearly someone who's dark.
exactly. And I think that, as people are kind of going through this and as this is being, kind of exposed, granted, this likely would have never happened if the administration in place wasn't currently there. And I say that because you can look at some of the stuff that was previously tried to be released under JFK, MLK, RFK. And because of the different agencies, to include the FBI that house a lot of these documents, I mean, unless the actual directors choose to work with the president in charge, it's not going to be released. And you saw basically many agencies working together in conjunction with President Trump signing that release order for the files. But again, I mean, there's been so much stuff leading up to this. Remember, I think it was on your show and back in March of what it was last year that we had the whistleblower that said that there was evidence destruction by the Biden administration at the FBI, specifically pertaining to Jeffrey Epstein. So do we even have the complete files? I don't think so. But from the files that we do have and the stuff that we're uncovering, I mean, it's really egregious. And I'm not saying that I don't think that people should be directly attacking the victims, because not all victims engaged in this. But remember, Ghislaine Maxwell's attorney is getting paid to represent and advocate for a pedophile trafficker. I don't think that she deserves special treatment. I don't think that she deserves a pardon. And I think for her to actually hold this information in exchange for, special treatment, when she's the one that was the reason why so many of these people were subject to what they were subject to, is really gross. But that's why I think that these discussions need to be had very publicly. And I think that, it is potentially something that the DOJ needs to consider, offer, limited immunities to some of these alleged victims that were engaging in, whatever it was that they were engaged in, for exchange for testimony, so that we can bring forward prosecution. But that is something that's way above my pay grade. And I think at the end of the day, I think that limited immunity only goes so far, because if someone engaged in, and I'm not saying that I've seen this, but if you have someone that literally engaged in the direct harm of a child that potentially resulted in bodily injury, whatever it might have been, I don't think that those people deserve to walk for immunity. I think that those people were complicit. But if you have someone that was then coaxed into traffic, I mean, I think that that's something that, again, is case by case basis. And so that's why the task force I would recommend should be formed.
So just two quick things. There are a lot of viral mentions about the 11-year-old, 10-year-old, people sending these photos to Jeffrey Epstein. Did you uncover who sent those photos of little children?
I looked directly at the emails that have been widely circulated pertaining to the age 11, and I have it written down on my notes, the permission to kill email, the Snow White, the littlest girl was naughty, etc. And those ones were directly sent by alleged victims, women. They were sent by women.
So the most disturbing and darkest and sickest emails were sent by women to Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, and some of them pertaining to, jerky, whatever that is. Yeah.
And so, and so, just quick follow. What is jerky? Like, what is that exactly?
I think that's the question. I don't know if it's like, and again, like going into specifically just based on what this is. I don't know.
It's a code word.
Context
it has to be a code word. Nobody talks about jerky like this.
Weird. Yeah, it's a code word and it's weird, but either which way.
We have beef jerky in the studio, okay? So, like, Klein and I know, I've never spoken to my team or anything. There's no correspondence to me talking about jerky this obsessively. There's hundreds of emails about jerky.
It's a code word, and some of those emails were sent by women, and women that specifically claim to be victims.
So you're saying that these victims are being groomed into
there's
becoming
evidence.
Traffickers themselves.
There's evidence of that. Yes, yeah, okay. I'm not saying all of them.
So they're not actually victims. They're not actually victims, or they're.
I think that there are some that are actual victims, but I also think that at a certain point, if you, depending on the severity of what you're doing, I think that there's a gray area, and then you become a co-conspirator.
Okay, so then the follow-up. 2 or 3 really quick follow-ups, Congresswoman. I know that you have to go. What was the darkest thing? Perhaps you haven't revealed it yet. What was the darkest thing that you've seen the unredacted files? You were able to go in.
Some of them. I've seen some of them. I had a very quick time, but I think some of the more disturbing stuff is finding out that,
anything else you can tell us? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've been publicly saying pretty much for the most part what I've seen. I really don't want to look at any of the images or the video files because there's certain things that you just can't unsee. Yeah. But I also understand that, I have an obligation as a congressional investigator. And I just think that this is a lot bigger than what people could have ever anticipated. But again, remember that there's also a massive machine that's trying to use this to smear the president. And I will say is that this has completely exonerated him.
What's your spiritual take on this? You're a Christian, you're a mother, you have a beautiful family. What's your spiritual take on what's actually happening here?
I think this type of stuff exists when people refuse to believe in God. And I think that this type of harm to children specifically is done because there's a spiritual element of how pure children can be. And I think that it's demonic. And I don't think that there's any way that you can chalk it up. But I pray every day, and I prayed before going in to look at the files, and I'm still praying. And I just think that we all need to remember that. But you can't get complicit in this if you say, well, that's it. Like, this is just, we're going to throw our hands up and not do anything. That's part of the spiritual battles. That's an attack. You have to get involved, and you have to make sure that you're always backing and on the right side of justice, and that is standing up for children.
So Jeffrey Epstein was a demon.
I think that he was absolutely a demon. Yeah.
Yeah. And do you see this final question? Do you see any signs of something, like greater occult or greater, network here that would sort of signal, like a grander conspiracy here? Because what
obviously,
what Alex Jones is saying on our show. This is he calls it the Rosetta Stone to the occult, is what he says.
Well, I think that Jeffrey Epstein clearly had intelligence ties. I mean, there's no question. But do I think that it was necessarily a U.S. intelligence tie? I don't think that I'm sold on that specifically because of how he was operating in certain foreign countries. But again, this is, I think, way bigger than just, and that's why I think a lot of the internet sleuths have been kicking up a lot of good stuff that even Congress is using to help try to find this stuff. So, but we'll see.